So in this session, we will hear from three regional experts about three different initiatives that are all leveraging strong partnerships, really community-driven conversations with a similar goal to reconnect people to our waterways through collaborative, community-based conversation to meet social equity and environmental objectives, and often meet those concurrently. We've heard a lot of interesting conversations about trade-offs between access and the environment, but I think there's a real conversation emerging about how we can do those two things jointly together. So the three projects we're going to hear about today are the Chattahoochee RiverLands, the Finding the Flint project, and the South River Forest. Each one of these are at different stages in their concept development and advancement, but all three aim to reconnect their communities to the natural environment by creating new trail networks and parks near rivers and green spaces while preserving vital natural resources and the functions that these waterways provide to the region. So again, my name is Byron Rushing. I'm a planner at the Atlanta Regional Commission. I mainly focus on walking, bicycling, trails, and livable communities. And as part of that, I was on the project team with the Chattahoochee RiverLands. And panelists, if it's okay with you, I'm going to read your bios to keep them a little shorter and we can move into the interesting information. So not hearing any objection. Dr. Nataki Osborne-Jelks is an associate professor at Spelman College. She is also the manager of the Community and Leadership Development Programs for the National Wildlife Federation and chair of the West Atlanta Watershed Alliance, which is an organization committed to ensuring environmental justice in Southwest Atlanta and Northwest Atlanta's African-American neighborhoods. She is an alumna of Spelman College. She has studied civil and environmental engineering at Georgia Tech and earned her Master of Public Health in Environmental and Occupational Health from Emory University. For her work to improve environmental quality and quality of life in Atlanta, Dr. Osborne-Jelks has received a humanitarian award from the Georgia Department of Labor, a Presidential Service Award from former U.S. President Bill Clinton, and recognition from her work in many publications, including but not limited to Red Book, Uptown, and Ebony magazines. And she is currently working on her first book on the contributions of women of color in the environmental justice movement, which I am super excited to read. Nataki, do you have anything else to add?
No, I think that pretty much sums it up.
And if you haven't heard Nataki's personal story, it's great, and hopefully she'll share a little bit about her perspective in her presentation. Our second panelist, Hannah Palmer, is a writer, historian, and designer obsessed with Southern stories and urban landscapes. Her award-winning memoir, Flight Path, A Search for Roots Beneath the World's Busiest Airport, combines personal and cultural history in what Book List called a passionate and gorgeously written reminder of why urban planning matters. Since 2017, she has led Finding the Flint, a campaign to reveal and restore the lost headwaters of Georgia's endangered Flint River. And she's going to tell us exactly where that headwaters is, which is an important part of the story. She is a graduate of Agnes Scott College, and she earned her Master in Fine Arts in Creative Writing from Sewanee, the University of the South. And I always love reading Hannah's work, including Flight Path, which is sitting right here on my desk. Browsing through it before the panel started this morning. And then finally, our third speaker is Ryan Gravel. Ryan is an urban thinker, designer, author, and builder, an entrepreneur working on ideas about the future of cities. His master's thesis in 1999 was the original vision for the Atlanta Beltline, a 22-mile transit and greenway corridor that is changing both the physical form of the city of Atlanta and the decisions people make about living there. Ryan has received many awards and much press related to his work on the Atlanta Beltline, and travels to share his story internationally. But an essential aspect of his work is yet to come. Alongside project work at his firm Six Pitch, he makes a compelling case for catalytic infrastructure and why it matters. In his book, Where We Want to Live, Ryan investigates the cultural side of infrastructure, describing how its intimate relationship with our ways of life can illuminate a brighter path for cities. And my copy of that book's on my bookshelf. I'm sorry, Ryan, I have Hannah's on my desk and yours is tucked away somewhere. But they're both great reads, and they are really illuminating to the story of both people and culture and history in the city of Atlanta that we all call home. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our panelists for a brief overview of each of the three projects that they came to talk about, a little bit about the background location and kind of the goals and objectives. And Nataki, we will start with you in the Chattahoochee RiverLands.
Okay, thank you so much. Can you all hear me? Okay, I assume that you can.
You.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much. And let me just also first apologize to the audience that is gathered here. I have to leave a little bit early before the Q&A is over because I have been invited for the first time to give some testimony before members of Congress in the Natural Resource Committee. And so I'm excited about that. And it's about funding for environmental justice communities, especially those who have been impacted by climate change. So it's related to this today. So let me just kind of talk a little bit about the Chattahoochee RiverLands. So the Chattahoochee River really is a shared historic, economic, cultural, and ecological resource that has a lot of value for the metropolitan Atlanta area. When we think about the drinking water source for over 70% of Metro Atlanta, when we think about recreational opportunities, when we think about this river that has been the source of water wars between Alabama, Georgia, and Florida, it's the Chattahoochee, which is home to this region. And the really interesting thing I think about this project, the Chattahoochee RiverLands, and you can go to the next slide, Crystal, and kind of where we are in this moment, around planning for what this river and river corridor can be, is that even though it's this great resource for our metropolitan Atlanta area, there are so many people who don't connect to it, who haven't really thought much about the river because in some respects it seems hidden. In many respects, there's some people in our region who can't access it. And so this project, the Chattahoochee RiverLands, is all about making sure that we can sort of make the Chattahoochee River sort of a household name in the Atlanta region, not just in the city of Atlanta. I have to stop myself. I'm a city of Atlanta resident. So I think a lot of times in city of Atlanta terms, but it's really about our entire region. And it's about, in terms of the study area, this is a 100-mile study area. So it covers lots of different locations, including, the urban core, but also, it starts up north, near Beaufort Dam, and it moves through the city of Atlanta, and you see these different parts of the river corridor. In some cases, there are close connections. Some people live, really along the river, and for others, when we think about the west side of Atlanta, where I live, it seems like something that's distant. For us on the west side of Atlanta, we think a lot more about our creeks and streams because people live alongside these creeks and streams. They flow through our front yards, our backyards, public parks, and school grounds, and other places that we can access. And sort of just like the Chattahoochee River, many of our creeks and streams in the urban core have been impacted over time by things like combined sewers and the pollution that come from this aging, old polluting infrastructure. And because many of these creeks and streams in our urban core and in other areas are tributaries to the Chattahoochee, then they end up impacting the Chattahoochee and contributing to its poor water quality in some respects. So this corridor, again, the study area for the RiverLands project really spans 100 miles through the metropolitan Atlanta region, from Beaufort Dam to the Chattahoochee Bend State Park, which is in Coweta County, which is south of the city of Atlanta. In terms of the study area itself, it focused on sort of a 1-mile buffer on both sides of the Chattahoochee River, with linkages to the larger watershed as well as to, again, the Atlanta region. This is, I think, a really interesting project, and once it is actually implemented, I think it can speak, or it will speak to the potential for collaboration amongst multiple jurisdictions. It crosses multiple jurisdictional boundaries. 7 counties, numerous cities, and different municipalities. When we think about the river itself, it actually forms the boundary of many counties and cities. So when I think about, where I am sitting today in Fulton County, the boundary between Fulton and Cobb counties, which is a neighboring county, suburb of the city of Atlanta, is the river. So, as you're crossing the river, you're crossing over into a different county, into a different jurisdiction. And so the potential for this project is not only about what it can be in terms of the public realm, but the collaboration that can be shared across these multiple jurisdictions, along with agencies like the Atlanta Regional Commission that Byron and Crystal, who you've heard from already, both work for. Next slide, please. So I wanted to quickly share sort of the project goals of the Chattahoochee RiverLands project. There are kind of 4 key goals. One, to have a safe, connected corridor. The Chattahoochee River, will connect, communities along the river, or the RiverLands project, excuse me, will connect communities along the river and metropolitan Atlanta. We're talking about things like connected trails, new parks, active public realm that will provide opportunities. And we really see like multiple opportunities here for better health and well-being of our metropolitan Atlanta region. We see opportunities along these trails and walkways for physical activity, for active transport, as well as, opportunities for more cohesion, amongst these different jurisdictions, and a connection, to the river itself. I mentioned earlier that for some people it seems away and distant, and not really a part of our everyday lives, but we really see an opportunity with this project for people to be connected to the river, for it to mean something to them. And part of that is having sort of a safe, connected corridor that people can actually go. They can get to the water's edge, that they can actually see the river, walk alongside the river where feasible. And this, I think, will bring about this new awareness as well as new opportunities for community-based conservation and stewardship of this river and its watershed and the river corridor. When we think about sort of the upswell of people just connecting to our natural resources, to our parks, greenways, and green spaces in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, I think we really see this potential for what the Chattahoochee RiverLands can bring as this 100-mile public realm. When the planning was happening, nobody was thinking about, things like COVID-19, but we were thinking about the need for Atlantans and other Georgians to connect to this resource. We understand that connecting to our natural resources, to parks, to green spaces, and to open space are key factors in terms of vibrant, healthy communities. We understand the potential for these resources to do things like relieve stress, to improve physical activity, to improve our mental, our mental conditions. And so we see that now in the midst of COVID-19. But even before that, we saw this river corridor and this project as being a huge sort of positive force to bring those things all together for our region. Another goal connected to this project is a common ground for all. We see this corridor, we see the Chattahoochee RiverLands as something that will be accessible to people of all backgrounds, to all abilities and ages. And what was really, I think, transformational for me about the planning process thus far is not that these audiences, that perhaps audiences that have been disconnected from the river, when we think about underserved communities, also when we think about those who might have, some challenges with physical mobility, or even with their visual health. We didn't just think about these types of audiences, but we engaged these audiences in the planning process. very early in the planning process, there was a deep dive into places like the west side of Atlanta, um, where the design team got out and walked along various corridors. They were, got a chance to visit Proctor Creek to see where it, where the confluence is of Proctor Creek and the Chattahoochee River. They heard from people in these communities who've been dealing with issues and challenges with respect to water quality and a lack of connection to the river. And their voices were heard. In terms of, people of different abilities, there were engagement days to engage with those folks, what we call river rambles. So we didn't just keep everything, sort of isolated to different charrettes that you usually see in a design process, but we got out on the ground in the watershed with the potential users of this project to hear from them, to understand potential barriers that we might want to try to overcome. So it's all about a common ground for all. Now, I know I'm running out of time, so let me kind of speed up here. This river we see as an ecological refuge for the region. So not just the river, but this corridor, the Chattahoochee RiverLands project. So it will improve the ecological health of the river basin. Included in this project are opportunities for ecological restoration, for acquisition of lands for development of new parks, for land conservation, and for other holistic approaches that will not only help us to protect sensitive species and ecosystems, but that would also help us to connect habitat together, to reduce habitat fragmentation, to improve water quality, and to promote sort of long-term restoration of biodiversity or a revival of biodiversity in this region. And then finally, the last goal is really to create a living legacy for future generations. This is a generational project that will establish a new sort of positive identity for the Chattahoochee River. Over time, we've seen the Chattahoochee in different phases. A lot of people think about it as being a polluted river, but for others, again, they think about it as this source of recreation, a place where people fish, where some people swim. We see it as a huge resource as it flows into the Apalachicola Bay, which has been touted as one of the most productive estuaries in the Northern Hemisphere. But we see this as a legacy, for future generations. So this planning process hopefully will help to guide how this area is developed for future generations, and not only how we develop it for human use, but how we also serve as stewards of this huge resource that is literally in our backyards, but sometimes just inaccessible. But that will all be changed with this project. Next slide. I think I've kind of talked through a lot of this. Let me just say, in terms of some of the elements before I close, the Greenway is a part of this. So there will be 125-mile multimodal trails as a part of this project. So there'll be some places where, we're looking at access to the river itself kind of up close. But in some places, there won't be, but there will still be, kind of these trails that, go along the river, that get people close to the river. There'll be trailheads, river crossings, and over 100 million residents will be within a 15-minute bike ride of this amazing project. Also, as we think about these connections, I didn't get a chance to talk about things like transportation, equity. When we talk about this being sort of a common ground for all, we also want to make sure that people who are dependent on public transit will have a way to access these trails, will have a way to get connected, to the Chattahoochee RiverLands corridor and to this amazing project. So the Greenway and river destinations will be kind of the centerpiece, but there will also be a Blueway trail system, tributary trails. And so when I talk about places like the west side of Atlanta where I live, we're looking at where underserved communities tap into this trail as well. And then In terms of the Riverlands, again, this is, we'll bring this all together to realize those project goals of having a safe, connected corridor, a common ground for all, an ecological refuge for the region, as well as a living legacy for future generations. And that is my last slide, and I'll pass it on. I think Hannah may be next.
Thank you, Nataki. I was taking screenshots the whole time. It's exciting to see that project move to this point. And I love that statistic about 1 million Atlantans within a 15-mile bike ride. It's just really exciting. So there's a lot of similar themes in Finding the Flint that I want to tell you about. If you have ever flown through Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson Airport, you have been very close to, perhaps on top of, the Flint River. You just didn't know it. And a lot of this project is about restoring not just access to the river, but awareness of the river and respect, really. All of Atlanta's rivers kind of have a bad reputation for being polluted, for being dangerous, for being inaccessible. And for a generation, they were. And it's pretty exciting to be part of this movement across the region to change that for our kids and their kids. I have a bunch of slides that I can go through pretty quickly. Crystal, you can go ahead to the next one. Just for orientation, for, not just, and I hope you guys can't hear the leaf blowers outside my window. Atlanta's blessed with many rivers and creeks. There's 14 major watersheds in Georgia. And the one I'm talking about is the Flint River. It's the second longest river in Georgia. It starts near the Atlanta airport. It flows 344 miles to the state line with Florida, where it joins the Apalachicola. And that's that ACF river basin that Nataki was mentioning. The Apalachicola Chattahoochee Flint River Basin has had the state of Georgia in litigation up to the Supreme Court level for a decade. These water wars between Alabama, Florida, and Georgia are part of the reason Finding the Flint exists. It's about very proactive, progressive stewardship of this shared resource. You can go to the next slide. The Flint River in Atlanta is not very well known, but you just drive about an hour south of Atlanta, and this is what it looks like. And it is truly a natural gem. This river is undammed, so it's one of about 20 rivers in the entire nation that flows more than 200 miles without a major impoundment. That means that it's home for all kinds of threatened species, and it's just really spectacular and fairly unknown to Atlantans, but throughout the state, Georgia relies on this river for not just drinking water supply, but also tourism, and it's the water supply for Georgia's agricultural industry. Next slide. Here in Atlanta, you haven't heard of it or seen it probably because this is where it starts. This is right next to Delta Airlines World Headquarters on the edge of the world's busiest airport. And this little stream you see in a concrete channel is the headwaters of the Flint River. I am from this area of Atlanta, and I've grown up with the Atlanta airport and seen the river sort of disappear. River mile by river mile, it's sort of, the headwaters have been swallowed up by the Atlanta airport and its surrounding industrial properties. But this is still the headwaters of the Flint, and you've driven past it probably, just didn't know. There's not a sign there to tell you. This is why we call the project Finding the Flint. You can go to the next slide. Remember that slide though, because I'll show you, that's kind of the before, and I'll show you an after rendering. Again, zooming out to the major geography, you're going to hear from all three of these watersheds today. The Flint River starts in East Point, Georgia, just a little spring, and it flows for about 1.5 miles underneath the runways of Hartsfield-Jackson and then into Clayton County. But it's right, we're right on the edge of two major watersheds. The Flint is flowing to the Gulf of Mexico. The South River is going to the Altamaha. And I just want to point out that the Flint River, even at the very first 10 river miles, is flowing through 2 counties and 6 cities. So it's a complicated terrain, and like the airport, it's sprawling across many jurisdictions. So collaboration and partnerships are key. If you can't just restore the Flint River in Hapeville, it's got to be a Aerotropolis-wide collaboration. just kind of a unique approach for a river project. This is the Flint River during the drought of 2007. This is downstream where you should be able to kayak or canoe. This was a truly an emergency for the state and the region, and part of why Finding the Flint was founded is the obvious need for regional collaboration to save this dwindling resource. But again, this is the only time Atlantans hear about the Flint is when it's running dry, or in the next slide, and this image is from last week when it floods. This is in Riverdale, Georgia. Over the last month, we've been hit by hurricanes, or the remnants of hurricanes. So a major storm event, 3 inches, 4 inches, and the Flint River floods and cuts off access to this hospital. So Clayton County residents are very familiar with the devastating impacts of drought and flood. And this is part of why Finding the Flint is not just about great looking trails and parks, but about restoring a healthy flow and ecological function to this very damaged urban river. Next slide. So this is where the river is flowing just south of the 5th runway of the airport. It's one of the first places you can pull over on the side of the road and see the headwaters of the Flint River. And all along with Finding the Flint, we've been thinking about how do you start to reconnect people to this lost asset. It truly is beautiful in places. It's also somewhat threatening, and it's in most places behind a barbed wire fence. So starting with just this question, and of course, that's my kid, I'm dragging him around in the rain, to think about where are the places that we could start to provide access again, whether it's a visual access, physical access, or just awareness about the airport. And with that mission in mind, you can go to the next slide. We started to look at the entire airport area, and the opportunities are a little different on the north side of the airport. There's smaller residential neighborhoods where the Flint River looks like a creek flowing, along the side of the road. That's where we saw places where we could create trails and pocket parks and small nature preserves where we could start to restore the stream and just provide greater infiltration upstream of the airport. Through the actual, 4,700 acres of the Atlanta airport, our main opportunity is just increasing green stormwater infrastructure on site, working with the airport. And where we can, if you're inside of the airport, if there are ways we can build awareness about where the water's flowing, what watershed you're in, and the beauty and plight of the Flint River inside that airport. That's 100 million people a year, well, pre-COVID, who would be seeing that information. South of the airport, we're working on some much larger kind of watershed scale projects to bring in multi-use trails that connect across the county and throughout the state. Start to try to repair some stream banks of the river that are really damaged by heavy runoff. And all these projects go hand in hand, where we can create big flood mitigation projects by perhaps converting a quarry to a reservoir. We also then open up the possibility that these wetlands could be part of a regional park system. So lots of different ideas all around the airport area. Here, go to the next slide, and I'll show you what a few of those might look like. Oh, no, that's coming later. We started calling the project Finding the Flint because we were taking lots of people around on these little scavenger hunts. The tour of the headwaters generally is me taking people underneath bridges and looking down storm drains to literally find the Flint and talk about the possibilities. Once you've found the Flint, and I've been doing these tours and engagements for about 2.5 years now with both elected officials, residents, students and teachers, and lots of different people in the airport area who know about the river but haven't ever seen it connected and part of a vision of the future of the airport area. The next slide. We started with that kind of level of community engagement, and then over the last 1.5 years, we've been doing a lot more kind of activities around river cleanups, water quality monitoring programs with students, and particularly working with residents who experience flooding to start to document and advocate for better infrastructure. With all of that engagement, we took some of our initial concepts for Finding the Flint projects and started to refine them with what we were learning from community members and elected officials and business owners. This is one example right at the source of the river. You can see calling it a river is generous here in College Park, but that's a stream in a concrete flume on a piece of industrial property that we have worked with residents to try to re-envision as a nature preserve. That's a little bit of a before and after rendering. So again, about a 7-acre project, but designed with the community. It could be a really exciting way to start to reclaim the river. At the next slide, and there's just a few more of these ideas we've got that we've taken into concepts working with stakeholders. This is that site right next to Delta's headquarters that I showed you. I think we're looking at it from a different angle, but that it's just like 2.5 acres right next to the world's busiest airport. What if we turn that into a public green space with trails and, you know, restoring the stream bank, providing the same or if not greater level of infiltration and flood mitigation that the airport needs, but also restoring a kind of public edge to the airport that doesn't exist now. The world's busiest airport does not have an observation area. It doesn't have public green spaces where you could just sit and watch planes. So we heard these sort of desires from Delta, from the airport, from communities, and started to combine that with, you know, our project, which was reclaiming this river. And next, south of the airport, there's a number of tributaries and opportunities to connect to trails through areas that are currently completely inaccessible, either because they're on private property or they're just like between, you know, Highway I-75 and 85. It's just kind of squeezed in these marginal spaces. So we've tried to re-envision some of those areas for trails and access. This particular site, we recently helped the Clayton County Water Authority acquire. Actually, we're able to buy 12 acres of floodplain land from a private developer, and now that's part of the county green space program. So the wins for finding the Flint start to look like that. These incremental you know, opportunities are now turning into projects that each of the counties and cities are pushing forward. And next, I think I have like 2 more slides. The next one is sort of zooming out and looking at the south side of the airport. This is that spot where I showed you a scene of flooding and devastation. The Clayton County Water Authority has proposed a very ambitious and perhaps long-term goal is to acquire an old quarry in the area and convert it to a reservoir for the county so that they could start to control floodwaters and manage flows in the Flint River from that point southward. So that sounded somewhat, you know, too ambitious when we first started talking, but as of like 2 weeks ago, or like last week when we were dealing with back-to-back floods on that bridge in Upper Riverdale Road, it's more and more realistic that the county needs to take very bold and visionary action to start to solve the flooding issues for residents. Once you do that, then you have all of these wetlands that could become parks and trails and different opportunities that change the whole perception of this part of the county, which is kind of, it's just all industrial because it serves the airport. And then my last slide, I just want to show you that this is what the Flint River looks like inside of the airport property. So there is a river running through the Atlanta airport. It's hidden, it's inaccessible. In some places, it's very degraded and dangerous. Other places, it looks like this. And it inspires me to go back into these areas and conduct cleanups and see people, even people who are from Atlanta or who've worked at the airport for a very long time, to see their jaws drop and think about the possibilities for returning this natural asset to the people who live and work in this area. And I will finish there and turn it over to Ryan.
Thank you, Hannah and Nataki. It's great to for me to get an update on these projects because it's a lot to follow. You would think that we were sort of fighting the Atlanta water wars on a panel discussion, but it's all good because it's all, you know, the attention to water issues in Atlanta and the physical waterways themselves and the watersheds more broadly is really important and very much needed here. Because we sit high in the headwaters, high in the watersheds, people don't, and we're not on the coast or major body of water, people seem to forget that we have water, and so the attention to it is really great. I am going to try to go quickly so we make sure we have some time for Q&A. So I hope you all have some questions for us. I did for the South River, though. I just wanted to say that, you know, it was mentioned Atlanta sits on the subcontinental divide. So the Flint River and the Chattahoochee River flow west and south to the Gulf of Mexico. The South River becomes the Ocmulgee and the Altamaha, and it flows out to the Atlantic Ocean right around St. Simon's Island. So we sit way up high, 1,000 feet over sea level. And because of that, all of the city, the industrial, commercial, pollution driving kind of city, all our traffic, all our airports and everything else are stuck in the headwaters. And so it's a unique kind of condition that's common along a lot of these waterways. I worked a few years ago in a project called the Atlanta City Design, which was for the city of Atlanta, looking at its future and all the change and growth that's coming. And one of the ideas that came out of that was the preservation of a major new green space along the South River. In addition to the Chattahoochee River frontage and other parks and green space projects throughout the city, there was an interest in protecting a forest on the south side of town that is not at the front lines of growth just yet, but it's certainly coming. As the region grows by another 2.5 million people over the next 20 years, like, we need to protect this land, and it's mostly unprotected. So when we finished that project, it was just a kernel of an idea, but I started working with the Nature Conservancy on fleshing out that idea. And that has evolved into the South River Forest, which looks not only at the conservation of the land for people, for habitat, for recreation and health and all those water quality, water control, all that kind of stuff, but also includes the communities that surround it, which are, you know, unsurprisingly, mostly low-income communities of color. This territory of the region was, you know, like many others, left behind, jumped over, forgotten by suburban growth and sprawl. And so it has several closed, but for at least 4 or 5 landfills. It has correctional facilities and demolished public housing sites and a lot of degraded urban land, a lot of big truck yards that drain their, you know, oils and things directly into the river. And so it's definitely a forgotten, degraded territory. But this is also, again, with the growth of the city moving southward, you know, we need to do something if we care about these communities and we care about protecting that land. So if you go to the next slide, I just have a couple of slides to share, but you can see the dark green area here, the solid green, I should say, solid darker green is our existing parks or protect nature preserves. So Southside Park, Constitution Lakes, there are about several large city and county parks within this territory. The hatched diagonal, you know, hatched lines are landfills. The lighter green, though, is, you know, private land, either private or public land, but non-park land. And so the idea is to develop strategies for each of those areas and bring them into this larger, you know, massive green space, which would be 3,500 acres inside our perimeter highway, which would be the largest. It's the last chance for Metro Atlanta to have a park that big, that close to downtown. It's all built on the South River, which is hard to see there, but it's going east and west through the site for about 4 miles. And then a branch north, Entrenchment Creek, which flows into the South River. The northern part is part of that tributary. All of that, 3,500 acres built on that to protect the watershed, nature, all that. It's a pretty wild territory. There's a lot of deer and other animals already here. There's a lot of people trespassing on private forest, you know, trying to, you know, get out away from their families during the pandemic and everything else. But to really protect it, we've got, you know, a lot of work ahead of us. Right now, it's just an idea. We're working through some sub-area strategies, looking at the different pieces and the strategies that would be built around that. For example, public land is different from private land, obviously from a you know, acquisition strategy. Also, forested land is different from deforested land, and so we're building strategies around the different pieces. The idea is to get all the partners to the table who are needed to pull it off and get them to see themselves in it, want it to happen, and then start investing themselves, their time, energy, and resources into making it possible. So it's the early stages of an idea. We are doing some community organizing for the surrounding communities to make sure that they see each other, having shared interests, and understand, you know, what the opportunities are here. We want to not only sort of mitigate the challenges that come with this kind of change in terms of housing costs and other costs of living, but also create new ladders of economic opportunities with the conversion, you know, creation of this park. And the Nature Conservancy, again, has a green jobs program. They've been working in the community for a long time. And so ideas to expand programs like that, find partners in housing and, you know, other things to sort of bring that alongside this transformation. So we're still very much in the early stages, but this last image, the last slide, is to show you our first big win, Lake Charlotte. If you go to the next slide, Crystal. This is a property known as Lake Charlotte, although the lake is long gone, and it was really more of a pond. But Lake Charlotte was the largest privately owned tract of forest in the city limits of Atlanta, 220 acres. Was just acquired officially, I think, just a few weeks ago. It's the first major investment in this landscape in a generation. It's a beautiful, high-quality forest, and it is now protected as a preserve. So Lake Charlotte will be one 220-acre important piece of this much larger territory. So while it's just an idea, we are seeing some early wins and excited about what the future holds. I told you I'd keep it short. That's all I got. Hopefully you all have some questions. I'm going to post in the chat a link to some more pictures of the South River Forest if you want to check it out.
Wonderful, and thank you, all three of you. Those were great introductions to those projects. I think anybody could probably spend this entire session or more talking about their individual project. But it's really exciting to see these three catalytic river-focused projects that encompass so much more alongside of them, kind of all emerging about the same time. Nataki, I know you need to run for a very important testimony. So when Nataki ducks off, I will try to do my best to answer Chattahoochee RiverLands questions. Haven't been involved with that, but we will certainly pass any other questions along to her also. So I have a few moderator questions, but we'd really love to hear in the next 15 minutes from anybody in the audience. So if you have a question, please type it in the chat box. I have that pulled up, and I'll do my best to look at that and read that off to the panel. But very briefly, while we're waiting for people to get their questions together, Ryan, Hannah, or Nataki, can each of you talk briefly about kind of the impetus for your individual project and what kind of partners or what kind of coalition you're envisioning to come together for that? And I think Nataki's had to leave. So Hannah, let's start with you. You talked a little bit about the need for flood control, but what was the institutional nudging for the Finding the Flint project?
Okay, well, I didn't mention that the three partners that came together to fund the initial study for Finding the Flint were the Atlanta Regional Commission and the Conservation Fund, which is a national nonprofit that does a lot of work in the Atlanta area, acquiring land for parks and green space, and American Rivers, which is another national nonprofit who works to tear down dams and restore rivers all over the country. The years of drought certainly drove American Rivers to get involved in the Atlanta area. They put the Flint River on one of their top 10 most endangered rivers in the country list. And so they've been doing a lot of work to get the water utilities organized in the South Metro region to coordinate on withdrawals from the river and to try to preserve flows in the river. All this is more technical than I have been involved in. At the same time, the Conservation Fund was working with the ARC on just ideas around the Aerotropolis movement, which is a concept supported by ARC, trying to generate collaborative planning in the airport area. And that initial sort of blueprint for the airport region kind of lacked parks and green space vision and sustainable development vision. So Finding the Flint sort of came out of several different ongoing studies. So the partners were already at the table before I got involved, and they included, economic development folks, all the elected officials, the water utilities, and then it just added environmental conservation organizations to that list.
The South River Forest, obviously, with, you know, the idea began with the City of Atlanta's city design. So that was the Department of City Planning within the city, within City Hall. And so they were obviously essential to get starting, but really the Nature Conservancy is the one that kind of took it on as a cause and has invested a fair amount of time and resources into you know, looking more closely, fleshing out the opportunity, and then trying to organize the other partners that ultimately will be needed to pull it off. So the Nature Conservancy isn't going to be the one to do all of this, but they're investing their time and resources into trying to get it going. The Conservation Fund is also a partner here. They were the one who managed through the transaction with Lake Charlotte, so they're a critical part. Other members of the Atlanta Tree Canopy Alliance, which include Trees Atlanta, the Georgia Conservancy, the Trust for Public Land, West Atlanta Watershed, Georgia Audubon, folks like that. They're also partners. The city's Department of Parks and Recreation is you know, doing some work, and this is certainly part of that. Lake Charlotte is the first big new park in city limits. But importantly, and maybe of interest to the folks here from Ohio, this proposal is actually only 1/3 of it is in the city limits. And so while it came out of the city's city design, it actually also significantly impacts the adjacent unincorporated part of DeKalb County. And so 2/3 of it are unincorporated DeKalb. DeKalb has 2 major parks in that territory, and a lot of downstream challenges on the South River. And so from a watershed management standpoint, both the city's Department of Watershed Management and the DeKalb County watershed will have a big role to play. And of course, we're just now formulating those kinds of partnerships. But I mean, it's kind of all hands on deck, and like the Flint and the Chattahoochee, and pretty much everything else that happens in Atlanta, it's very complex, multi-jurisdictional coordination, which makes it messy and maybe not always fun, but it's important work. And there's a lot of folks in Atlanta who are trying to make it happen. So I don't know.
Yeah, and that's important, Ryan. And I think for a little bit of context setting, so the metropolitan Atlanta region is variously 10, 13, or 20 counties when we get out to our full MPO extent. And that 20 county transportation district includes nearly 100 cities. So nothing happens in Metro Atlanta without several political jurisdictions, and more likely than not, several neighborhood groups, nonprofit organizations, several stakeholder groups. There's a large and increasing table in every project that we do. So I was going to have a little bit of a follow-up question on that, Ryan, after you mentioned how do we work between several different city councils and county commissions, neighborhood organizations. How do you approach that kind of big and increasing stakeholder conversation around a river that's running? You know, the river's feeling the impacts of several different types of communities, and we need to bring lots of people into that conversation. The other question I was going to have, and maybe a little bit more for Hannah, is on the Chattahoochee RiverLands project, we talked about few people know that Atlanta has a river. And if they do have a river, they think of the Chattahoochee, let alone the Flint River or the South River. So how do we, kind of similar to that, like bring the stories of these watersheds out to their communities, or maybe the broader region as a whole? So I think that's one part, 2-part question about bringing people into this conversation, either decision makers or residents.
I'll answer the first one. You know, we're taking a multi-pronged, approach. I mean, and it's in some ways it's opportunistic, and sometimes it's strategic. I mean, it's first is, you know, because this area has been literally left behind and forgotten about. It's been the place where, you know, the city and the county throw a bunch of the stuff that they don't want, you know, like correctional facilities, and so they're not used to seeing it as an aspirational part of town. And they're used to hearing a lot of pushback from the communities about those decisions. And so, we have to both get the jurisdictional folks to see the opportunity and to change their mind about what it is and what it could be. So that's one kind of set of strategies. And then the other way is to get the communities, which typically are used to being dumped on, just to think aspirationally about what they want. So sort of beyond just the mitigation of the change, again, in terms of like housing affordability, fears of gentrification and stuff like that, but also see themselves in that future. And that takes real, grassroots on the ground kind of organizing efforts. And so again, I'm not just saying it, I'm impressed with the Nature Conservancy's willingness to invest in community organizing, because most big organizations like that, they focus on, they're the nature, their job is nature, and they're focused on nature, but they're recognizing, and I think a lot of big organizations are, that when they work in, especially in urban communities and especially in low income communities of color, that the decisions that they make have implications for those communities. And so their job is not affordable housing, their job is not, social justice or whatever, but they can and need to find partners to bring into that effort. And it's pretty impressive to see that happening. Again, we're in the early stages and who knows how it will go. But I think a multi-prong, you can't just do one thing, it's multifaceted. And until you have the resources to do it, it's tough. That's where we are.
And Ryan, you're referring to dumping undesired land uses, not just like literal tires and.
Well, yeah, undesirable land uses, but also kind of looking the other way with illegal dumping. There's been major tire fires on public land. I mean, it's kind of crazy in a lot of ways. It's about turning a blind eye to a part of town because that just happens, and everybody's attention is on other places which are also need attention, and it's not to take it away from that, but when you've got a territory this large that's been forgotten and left behind, I mean, it's hard to get it the attention that it needs to survive.
And literal dumping. This is where Atlanta's landfills have been all clustered and located for generations.
The landfills are closed, and if you happen to find yourself on top of them illegally, the view is incredible.
And Hannah, so bringing that river story to decision makers and communities, and I'm sitting here looking at I found the Flint sticker.
Yes, I have one on my phone. I mean,
Perfect.
Don't underestimate the value of marketing, branding, and storytelling to try to, revive a reputation of a lost river. I'm first of all a writer and storyteller, so that's why I ended up with this job. Not because I'm a river expert, but I have learned a lot about rivers in the process. Just an example, I was in a very dull technical meeting this week about FEMA funding. And after the meeting, I was talking about finding the Flint, and after the meeting, a fire chief, contacted me, and he wanted to share this story about learning how to swim in the Flint River as a kid and what it meant to him. And I was like, there's these powerful emotional connections to the places where we learned to swim, and where you skinny dipped, and where you had like a experience in the water, fishing with your dad, or, and those are really the deep motivators that get people involved in these projects and keep them going long after you've worked on these really boring grant applications and really tough public meetings. I mean, it all comes back to creating experiences where people can fall in love with the river again, or just tell the story that it was 20 years ago that they were able to last wade in that creek, or have an experience along the waterfront. So I spend a lot of time with community members. We try to gather those stories and tell them on our blog, or just have a social media presence to share the stories that we hear, because it really comes from all walks of life. And it's the Flint River in particular, because it flows through Clayton County. The people who are, fishing and enjoying the river in certain parts of the county are often Hispanic folks or retired African-American folks. It's not the story of that you get further down in South Georgia, where people are fly fishing or, having a totally different experience of the river. So I don't know, we've been intentional about inviting artists and writers and musicians and collaborators to come along on tours and to try to translate the experience of this sort of suppressed river into new artwork and new photography and films. But you know, we're trying to juggle a million things at once, and I just try to continue to go back to what inspires me to be involved. And it's often what also inspires the other people around the table. Why they care about this is everybody has that emotional connection to the river on some level, and we want to bring that out just to you know, to keep people engaged and to fight for a future where, like I said, future generations can have those experiences.
Hey, Byron, one last
Yep.
thing. Shout out to all the people who have been working on these rivers for generations. I mean, the Chattahoochee Riverkeeper has done incredible work, hard work when nobody cared and nobody was paying attention. They laid the groundwork for the same thing, the Flint Riverkeeper and the South River Watershed Alliance. I mean, these folks were doing the hard work for a long time. And now that the watersheds in Metro Atlanta are starting to get the attention that they need, I just want to make sure that those folks are always remembered.
Absolutely, Ryan. And you took the words out of my mouth, because my follow-up question, and Crystal, we're right at 2:15, so I think we're probably going to start to lose folks in just a moment.
Yeah, we have another session at 2:30, so we will need to wrap up in the next 2 or 3 minutes.
Okay, so Ryan, I think you make a great point that the Chattahoochee River benefited from several historical impetuses: the fear of suburban sprawl, the utility that the Chattahoochee River provides for drinking water for a majority of the metro region, the Army Corps of Engineers and the dam that they control upstream from the Chattahoochee. A lot of these things spurred Governor Jimmy Carter at the time, and then President Jimmy Carter, and lots of grassroots support to take an interest in the Chattahoochee River in the 60s and 70s. And it resulted in the National Park System's Chattahoochee River Recreational Area, which are 15 units upstream in the northern half of the region that provide really, I think when people think about hiking in Metro Atlanta, a lot of people think about some of the units alongside the Chattahoochee River. So a lot of that came from citizen groups like the Chattahoochee Riverkeeper, and political generations in the city of Atlanta, who I like the way you put that, brought attention to the Chattahoochee River when nobody else cared. So what as maybe a final wrap up, what do each of you think 40 years of continued advocacy look like in the metro region, either in your project or where do you see this going over the next 2 generations?
Well, it depends, right? We're kind of going to be we're either past the fork in the road, or we're in it, or we're about to get to it. I don't know, but you know, and people can advocate for anything, right? And we can continue to fight and yell and do things in a small way. But with the growth of the region, if we don't invest heavily in these watersheds, then we will lose the opportunities. So, you know, the region, again, is 5.5 million people now. According to ARC, it's be 2.5 million more in 20 years. That's like moving Charlotte to Atlanta in 20 years without really doing much about transportation. And so that the growth and the pressure on this territory for growth and people and occupation is really high. So we need to protect the land, and you know, we just have to do it, and that is gonna cost money. The South River Forest, we can do about 1/3 of it on land that's already owned by the public sector. But if we really want to do it right, we have to buy that other land, and that takes resources. Right now, it's not that expensive actually, but we have to come up with it and do it. So I think from an advocacy standpoint, advocating for funding, both public funding, philanthropic funding, whatever, other ways, you know, we have to do it. And so our ability to look back in 40 years and see significant change will depend on whether we've been able to accomplish that task.
Just, you know, I'm talking about a river that's flowing underneath the airport, and during the pandemic, we've seen like historic slowdowns at the world's busiest airport, and it's given us a glimpse of a future where the airport doesn't completely dominate our neighborhood. So I hope for a vision in 40 years from now that where the South Side is sort of developed and driven just as much by sustainable development, community development, as it has been by economic development that has been at the expense of both the residents who are here, and also the creeks and rivers, and the natural resources that are here. So I just hope for a more balanced vision of the airport itself and how it affects the surrounding communities. That would be the first step towards reclaiming and restoring the Flint River.
Great, wonderful, and thank you both for the great visions, the great projects, and really the great leadership in the city of Atlanta over the years. I've learned a lot from both of you, as well as Nataki, and we will wish her the best for her big testimony that she has coming up this afternoon. So thank you to everybody for attending. Crystal, I have seen Ryan, Hannah, and Crystal put links to each of those individual projects, findingtheflint.org and ChattahoocheeRiverLands.com and RyanGravello.com. So please go visit those links and feel free, Crystal, I'm hoping that all of our contact information is in the program. So feel free to reach out to any of us if you have additional questions.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. That was a great session. And I encourage everybody who's still on here to make their way back to the MORPC Summit Live main page to pick out their next breakout session. I will say the next one coming up that's from the Atlanta region is focused on urban agriculture planning. So we'll have a great discussion there about what's been going on with the city of East Point, Georgia, and the Food Wall Alliance, along with ARC. So we'll see you another time.